The morning sun glinted off the polished chrome of 23 pristine helicopters lined up on the tarmac at Meridian Flight Academy. Each machine represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in cutting-edge technology, sleek carbon fiber. Bodies, advanced avionics, and engines that purred like contented cats. Then there was Sarah Chun's helicopter. "Jesus, Chun, did you fish that thing out of a junkyard?" Marcus Steele's voice carried across the hangar, dripping with the kind of condescension that came naturally to those born into wealth. His Eurocopter EC-135 gleamed behind him like a metallic jewel, its paint job alone worth more than most people's cars. Sarah ran her hand along the faded green paint of her Bell UH when Huey, feeling the familiar texture of patches and repairs that told the story of decades in service. The helicopter had seen action in Vietnam, served as a medical transport in rural Alaska, and somehow ended up in her grandfather's salvage yard 20 years ago. Now it was her ticket to completing flight school if she could keep it running long enough. "At least it flies," she muttered, checking the oil level for the third time that morning. "Does it though?" Brittany Walsh joined Marcus, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her tablet. As the daughter of Walsh Aviation's CEO, she'd never known anything but the newest, fastest, most expensive aircraft. "I heard Professor Martinez had to call the FAA just to make sure that Relic was legal to operate." A cluster of other students gathered around, smartphones already out, recording Sarah's morning routine for their social media feeds. #vintage vibes, #flight school fail, #retro but risky. The hashtags would be trending before lunch. "Attention students." Professor Martinez's voice boomed across the hangar. The grain flight instructor had logged over 10,000 hours in everything from crop dusters to military transports, and his weathered face showed every mile. "Today's exercise is advanced navigation in adverse conditions. You'll be flying a predetermined route through the mountains, dealing with simulated equipment failures and weather challenges." Sarah's stomach tightened. The Huey's navigation system consisted of a compass, an altimeter, and a GPS unit she'd bought on eBay that worked about 70% of the time. While her classmates relied on glass cockpits with redundant systems, she'd learned to navigate the old-fashioned way by landmarks, wind patterns, and instinct inherited from her grandfather, who'd flown rescue missions in Alaska for 30 years. "Additionally," Martinez continued, "this exercise will count for 40% of your final grade. Those who fail to complete the course within the time limit or with major safety violations will be dismissed from the program." The hangar fell silent except for the distant hum of ground equipment. Sarah felt 23 pairs of eyes turn toward her. She knew what they were thinking, that the girl with the antique helicopter was about to wash out spectacularly, probably taking a few innocent bystanders with her when the ancient machine finally fell apart. Marcus Steele stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. "You know, Chun, there's no shame in dropping out now. Save yourself the embarrassment. My father's company is always looking for dispatchers. Desk job, steady pay, no risk of becoming a grease stain on a mountainside." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Thanks for the offer, Marcus. I'll keep it in mind when you're explaining to your daddy why you couldn't cut it as a pilot." His face flushed red, but before he could respond, Martinez was calling for pre-flight checks. Sarah turned back to her helicopter, running through the familiar routine that had become second nature. Oil pressure, hydraulic fluid, rotor blade inspection, engine cowling secure. Every nut, bolt, and rivet had been personally maintained by her own hands over the past 2 years. "Student Chun." Martinez appeared at her shoulder, his expression unreadable. A word. They walked to the edge of the hangar, away from the curious ears of her classmates. The professor's voice was quiet, concerned. "Sarah, I have to ask, are you certain that the aircraft is ready for today's conditions? We're looking at mountain flying, potential weather, and some challenging terrain." if you have any doubts about your equipment. Professor, I've been flying this bird for 2 years. I know every quirk, every rattle, every way she wants to be handled. She's not pretty, but she's reliable. Martinez nodded slowly. Your grandfather was a hell of a pilot. Saved more lives in that piece of junk than most pilots do in million-dollar machines. But Sarah, he paused, choosing his words carefully. This isn't Alaska bush flying. This is about proving you belong among the next generation of commercial aviators. The industry is moving toward automation, glass cockpits, fly-by-wire systems. Skills are important, but so is adapting to modern equipment. I understand, sir. But this is what I have to work with. Fair enough. He handed her a sealed envelope containing her route assignment. Launch is in 30 minutes. The weather briefing indicates possible storms moving in from the west, so don't dawdle up there. As Martinez walked away, Sarah felt the familiar weight of doubt settling on her shoulders. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was clinging to the past, trying to prove something that didn't need proving. Her savings account had exactly $347 in it, not enough to buy even a single component from one of the newer helicopters. If she failed today, there wouldn't be a second chance. Hey, museum piece. Brittany's voice cut through her thoughts. Hope you filed a flight plan with the Smithsonian. Laughter rippled through the group of students. Someone had started a betting pool on whether Sarah would make it past the first checkpoint. The odds weren't in her favor. Sarah climbed into the Huey's pilot seat, the familiar worn leather conforming to her body like an old friend's embrace. She ran through her startup checklist, listening to the turbine engine wind up to its operating speed. The sound was different from the quiet hum of modern helicopters, rougher, more honest somehow, like the difference between a hand-forged blade and a factory-stamped knife. One by one, the sleek modern helicopters lifted off, their pilots confident in their superior technology. Sarah watched them disappear into the morning sky, leaving her alone on the tarmac with her grandfather's old warhorse. All right, girl, she whispered to the helicopter, patting the worn instrument panel. Let's show them what we're made of. The Huey's rotor blades bit into the air with their distinctive whoop-whoop sound, lifting the old machine into the clear morning sky. As they climbed toward the mountains, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different, that something was waiting for them up there among the peaks and valleys that would test not just her flying skills, but everything she believed about the value of experience over technology. She was right. What do you think will happen next? Share your predictions in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling stories. The route took Sarah northeast into the Cascade Mountains, where jagged peaks pierced a sky that had been clear just an hour earlier. Now dark clouds were building with ominous speed, their bottoms heavy with rain and their tops reaching toward the flight levels where ice crystals formed. Sarah's first checkpoint was Glacier Lake, a pristine alpine body of water nestled between two ridges about 40 miles from the academy. The Huey climbed steadily, her grandfather's engine running smooth and strong despite its age. At 8,000 feet, Sarah leveled off and began her search for the lake using a combination of compass headings and landmark navigation that would have been standard procedure 50 years ago. Her radio crackled to life. Flight 27, this is Flight 15, Marcus here. Just past checkpoint Alpha, right on schedule. How's the antique holding up, Chen? Before Sarah could respond, another voice joined the frequency. Flight 15, Flight 23. Brittany. Here, just hit checkpoint Alpha myself. Sarah, you might want to consider turning back. These clouds are building fast, and I'm not sure that old bird can handle instrument conditions. Sarah keyed her microphone. Flight 27 to all stations. I'm proceeding as planned. Thanks for the concern. What she didn't tell them was that her GPS had already started acting up, losing signal intermittently as she climbed higher into the mountains. The Huey's ancient radio was also picking up static that seemed to intensify as the storm. Clouds grew thicker. 20 minutes later, she spotted the distinctive U-shape of Glacier Lake below and to her left. Checkpoint Alpha. She was actually ahead of schedule, having taken a more direct route through a mountain pass that required precise altitude management, something the Huey's simple instruments handled just fine once you learned to read them properly. Flight 27, Checkpoint Alpha, she reported, marking her time and heading for the next waypoint. The second checkpoint was Devil's Canyon, a narrow gorge that cut through the mountains like a wound. As Sarah approached the area, the clouds began to close in around her, reducing visibility and creating an eerie twilight even though it was barely noon. That's when she heard the first distress call. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. Flight 15 declaring emergency." Marcus's voice was high with panic, barely recognizable. "Engine failure, engine failure." Attempting auto-rotation too. The transmission cut off in a burst of static. Sarah's blood went cold. Engine failure in the mountains was every pilot's nightmare, especially with weather moving in. She immediately changed course toward Marcus's last known position, her hands working the controls with practiced efficiency. "Flight 15, Flight 27. Marcus, do you copy?" "Nothing but static." Any station, this is Flight 27. "Did anyone copy Flight 15's position?" Professor Martinez's voice came through clearly from the Academy's radio room. "Flight 27, we have Flight 15's last GPS position. Transmitting coordinates now. Emergency services are being notified, but you're the closest aircraft to his location." Sarah copied down the coordinates and plotted them on her sectional chart. Marcus had gone down in a heavily forested area about 15 miles northwest of her position, in terrain that would be nearly impossible to reach by ground vehicles. "Flight 27 proceeded to assist," she reported, banking the Huey toward the coordinates dot as she flew deeper into the mountains. The weather continued to deteriorate. What had started as scattered clouds was becoming a full-scale storm system, complete with rain, gusty winds, and lowering ceilings that forced her to fly uncomfortably close to the mountainsides. Her radio crackled again. "Sarah, this is Brittany. I'm trying to reach Marcus's position, but my weather radar is showing severe turbulence ahead. I'm not sure I can get through safely." More voices joined the frequency as other students reported similar problems. The storm was advancing faster than anyone had anticipated, and the sophisticated weather detection systems on their modern helicopters were all telling them the same thing: turn back, seek shelter, wait for better conditions. But Sarah's old Huey didn't have weather radar. What it had was a pilot who'd learned to read storms the way her grandfather had taught her, by watching cloud formations, feeling wind patterns through the controls, and trusting instincts honed by years of flying in Alaska's notoriously unpredictable weather. She pressed on. The rain started as light drops on her windscreen, then quickly intensified to a steady downpour that reduced visibility to less than a mile. Sarah dropped lower, following the contours of the valleys and using ridgelines as navigation aids. The Huey bounced and shuddered in the turbulent air, but the old machine held together, its robust construction designed for exactly these kinds of conditions. "Flight 27, this is Professor Martinez. Sarah, I'm ordering you to return to base immediately. This weather is beyond the scope of today's exercise." "Negative, Professor. I have a clear path to the crash site. Flight 15 may need immediate assistance." "Damn it, Chen. You're not equipped for this kind of weather." But Sarah was already committed. Through the rain and clouds, she caught sight of something that didn't belong in the wilderness, a flash of metallic blue among the green of the forest canopy. Marcus's helicopter. She keyed her microphone. "Flight 27 has visual contact with the downed aircraft. Proceeding to investigate." The crash site was in a small clearing barely large enough for the Huey to land. Sarah circled once, evaluating the terrain and wind conditions. The trees were tall enough to create downdrafts and wind shear, and the wet ground would be soft and potentially unstable. It would be a challenging landing under the best of conditions, and these were far from the best. But as she completed her circle, she saw movement near the wreckage. Marcus was alive, waving frantically from beside his crumpled helicopter. And he wasn't alone. Sarah could make out at least 2 other figures near the crash site. That's when she realized this wasn't just a training exercise gone wrong. This was something much more serious. Sarah lined up for her approach, the Huey, responding to her inputs with the steady reliability of a machine built for war. As she descended through the swirling wind and rain, she caught a clearer view of the crash site and felt her pulse spike. The 2 figures standing over Marcus weren't rescue personnel. They were armed men in military-style clothing, and they were definitely not supposed to be part of any training exercise. One of them was pointing a rifle directly at her approaching helicopter. "Oh hell," Sarah whispered, her mind racing through options. She was committed to the landing now, too low and slow to climb away quickly. The Huey settled toward the clearing as Sarah's world suddenly became much more complicated than a simple rescue mission. Whatever was happening here, Marcus had stumbled into something dangerous. And now so had she. The ancient helicopter touched down in the muddy clearing with a solid thump, its robust landing gear absorbing the impact as rain drummed against the aluminum skin. Through the side window, Sarah could see the armed men moving toward her, their weapons raised. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached the Huey. 30 seconds to figure out how a routine training flight had turned into something that looked like a combat situation, and 30 seconds to decide whether to try to take off again, leaving Marcus to whatever fate awaited him, or stay and risk becoming a prisoner herself. The choice, as it turned out, would be made for her. Sarah's hands moved instinctively to the collective and cyclic controls, preparing to lift off immediately, but a sharp crack against the windscreen stopped her cold. One of the armed men had fired a warning shot, the bullet leaving a spider web of cracks in the plexiglass just inches from her head. "Shut it down now." The man's voice was barely audible over the engine noise, but his gestures were unmistakable. He wanted her to cut the engine. Sarah's mind raced through her options. The Huey could lift off in seconds, but not before these men could put several rounds into the cockpit. The helicopter's aluminum skin might stop small-caliber rounds, but at this range, there was no guarantee. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, she could see Marcus more clearly now. He was on his knees beside his wrecked helicopter, his hands zip-tied behind his back. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and his expensive flight suit was torn and muddy. One of the gunmen, a tall man with military bearing and cold eyes, stepped into her line of sight and drew his finger across his throat. The message was clear: shut down or die. Sarah slowly pulled the throttle to idle and began her shutdown checklist. As the Huey's turbine wound down and the rotor blades began to slow, she activated her emergency locator beacon with a discreet switch beside her seat. If anyone was monitoring emergency frequencies, they'd know something was wrong. The silence after shutdown was deafening, broken only by the sound of rain drumming on the helicopter's skin and the approaching footsteps of armed men. Out! Hands! Visible! The tall man yanked open her door, gesturing with his assault rifle. Up close, Sarah could see he was older than she'd first thought, maybe 50, with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in harsh conditions. His accent was faint but distinctly Eastern European. Sarah climbed out slowly, her hands raised. The second gunman, younger, nervous-looking, kept his weapon trained on her while the leader spoke into a handheld radio in a language she didn't recognize. "Who are you people?" Sarah demanded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "This is U.S. airspace. You're interfering with a legitimate rescue operation." The leader smiled coldly. "Rescue operation? Yes, I suppose that is what you thought this was. He gestured toward Marcus. Your friend here was not as unfortunate as you believe. He was directed to this location very precisely. Sarah's blood chilled as the implication sank in. You caused his engine failure? A small electromagnetic pulse device, very sophisticated. His fancy computer-controlled helicopter simply ... stopped working. Yours, however, he examined Huey with professional interest. This old machine has no computers to disable. Analog controls, mechanical systems, very inconvenient. Marcus lifted his head, his eyes finding Sarah's. I'm sorry, he whispered. They said they'd kill me if I didn't cooperate. The emergency call, the coordinates, it was all planned. Silence. The leader backhanded Marcus, sending him sprawling. In the mud, you have done your part. Now you are merely insurance. Sarah's training kicked in, her mind automatically cataloging details that might prove useful later. 3 men totaled: the leader, the nervous younger one, and a third who had emerged from the tree line, older and built like a linebacker. All were armed with military-grade weapons and equipped with tactical gear. They moved with the precision of professional soldiers. What do you want? Sarah asked. What we want, Miss Chen, is very simple. We want you to fly us to a specific location. Your helicopter is the perfect vehicle for our needs, old enough to avoid modern tracking systems, simple enough to operate in adverse weather, and robust enough to carry additional cargo. How do you know my name? The leader smiled again, and Sarah noticed for the first time that he was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. We know many things about you. Sarah Chen, age 24, granddaughter of Alaska bush pilot William Chen. Top student in your class despite flying an aircraft that belongs in a museum. No family, no significant relationships, limited financial resources. You are, one might say, expendable. The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were meant to hurt, but because they were largely accurate. Sarah had poured everything into flight school, sacrificing social connections and financial security for the dream of becoming a professional pilot. I won't help you, she said firmly. Oh, but you will. The leader nodded to the linebacker, who stepped forward with a small device that looked like a ruggedized tablet. You see, we have been monitoring your classmates' progress today. Several other helicopters are currently grounded due to weather, but 2 are still airborne, attempting to reach this location. The tablet screen showed a map with moving icons representing aircraft positions. Sarah could see 2 helicopters approaching their location from different directions. Your friends are coming to help, the leader continued. Miss Walsh and her expensive Eurocopter, and Mr. Thompson in his shiny Robinson. They will arrive within 15 minutes. Unless, of course, you agree to transport us to our destination, in which case we will simply disappear, and your classmates will find an empty crash site with no sign that we were ever here. And if I refuse, then we will demonstrate to your friends what happens when people fail to cooperate with us. 3 aircraft will crash today instead of 1. The mountains are full of dangers after all. Unexpected weather, equipment failures, navigation. ERORS. Sarah felt sick. These weren't random criminals. They were professionals with sophisticated equipment and detailed intelligence. They'd planned this operation carefully, using Marcus as bait and counting on her rescue instincts to deliver exactly what they needed. A pilot and aircraft capable of operating in conditions that would ground more sophisticated helicopters. Where do you want to go? She asked quietly. A facility approximately 100 kilometers northeast of here. We will provide navigation coordinates. The flight should take 45 minutes in current weather conditions. What's at this facility? That is not your concern. Your concern is flying safely and following instructions precisely. Deviate from the planned route, attempt to communicate with authorities, or make any other clever moves, and we will use this. He held up a small device with a single red button. A remote detonator, very compact, very powerful. We took the liberty of attaching an explosive device to your helicopter's fuel tank while you were contemplating your options. Even if you somehow managed to overpower all three of us, pressing this button would end your rescue fantasies permanently. Sarah's knees almost buckled. She thought of all the time she'd lovingly maintained the Huey, never imagining that someone would strap a bomb to it. The helicopter wasn't just her transportation. It was her connection to her grandfather, her gateway to a career, her most valuable possession. "You're bluffing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The nervous young gunman, who'd been silent until now, spoke up in accented English. "Boss, the other helicopters are getting closer. We need to move." Thunder rumbled overhead, and the rain intensified. The storm was fully upon them now, turning the clearing into a muddy morass and reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. "Decision. Time, Miss Chen," the leader said. "Fly us where we want to go, and everyone lives. Refuse, and we eliminate all witnesses and find another way to our destination. Your choice, but choose quickly." Sarah looked at Marcus, who was watching her with desperate eyes. She thought about Brittany and Thompson flying through dangerous weather to help someone they barely tolerated. She thought about her grandfather. Who would have said that sometimes there's no good choice, only the choice you can live with? "I'll need to file a flight plan," she said finally. "No flight plans, no radio communications except what we authorize. You will fly low, follow terrain, and avoid all controlled airspace. That's impossible in this weather. I need radar advisories. Terrain clearance. You will navigate as your grandfather did, by skill and instinct." The leader's research was disturbingly thorough. "Load the cargo." The linebacker disappeared into the tree line and returned with 2 large duffel bags that looked heavy and awkward. Sarah's pilot training automatically assessed weight and balance. Whatever was in those bags was dense and substantial. "What's in there?" she asked. "Supplies for our mission. Nothing that will affect your aircraft's performance." As the bags were loaded into the Huey's cargo compartment, Sarah caught a glimpse of metallic components through a partially opened zipper. Electronics of some kind, along with what might have been firearms or specialized tools. "Marcus comes with us," she said suddenly. "Absolutely not. Then I don't fly. You need him as insurance anyway. If you kill him here, his GPS tracking will show exactly where he went down. But if he disappears, if his helicopter is found without a body, it looks like he survived and wandered off. No massive search and rescue operation focused on this exact location." The leader considered this for several long seconds while rain drummed on the helicopter's aluminum skin. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. But he remains restrained, and any attempt at heroics will result in immediate consequences." They hauled Marcus into the Huey's cabin, securing him with additional zip ties to a cargo ring. The 3 gunmen climbed aboard, weapons ready, while Sarah strapped herself into the pilot's seat. As she began her startup procedure, Sarah's mind was already working on the problem. These men had planned carefully, but they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They thought flying the Huey was like driving a car, that once you knew the destination, getting there was simply a matter of following directions. They didn't understand that in a helicopter, especially an old one, the pilot held dozens of tiny advantages. Control inputs that could be disguised as normal flying. Emergency procedures that could be initiated without warning. And most importantly, intimate knowledge of an aircraft's capabilities and limitations. The Huey's turbine spooled up, and Sarah began to lift off from the muddy clearing. As they climbed into the storm-darkened sky, she keyed her microphone briefly that it might have been accidental. "Flight 27 airborne," she transmitted, then immediately switched off her radio before anyone could respond. It wasn't much of a message, but it told anyone listening that she was alive and flying. In the world of aviation, Sometimes that was enough to start a chain of events that could save lives. Now she just had to stay alive long enough for help to arrive and figure out how to stop whatever these men were planning to do when they reached their destination. Behind her, the leader spoke quietly into his handheld radio, updating unknown parties on their progress. Whatever operation was unfolding, Sarah realized she was now an unwilling participant in something much larger and more dangerous than a simple kidnapping. The Huey banked northeast, disappearing into the storm as two other helicopters finally reached the empty clearing below, their pilots finding only tire tracks, disturbed earth, and the lingering smell of aviation fuel on the wind. The tension is building. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button and let me know in the comments which character you're rooting for. Your support helps me create more incredible stories like this one. The Huey bucked and shuddered through the turbulent air as Sarah flew northeast, following a compass heading that took them deeper into the mountains. The storm had intensified, turning the world outside into a gray-green blur of rain and mist that made navigation by landmarks nearly impossible. "Altitude too high," the leader barked from behind her. "Stay below radar coverage." Sarah glanced at her altimeter. They were at 4,200 feet, barely clearing the ridgelines in this terrain. Going any lower in these weather conditions would be suicide, but arguing the point while armed men held guns on her seemed unwise. "Sir, minimum safe altitude in this terrain is," I said lower. Sarah eased the collective down, dropping to 3,800 feet. The peaks around them disappeared into the cloud base above, and she found herself flying through a gray tunnel between mountainsides she could barely see. Every pilot instinct she possessed screamed against this kind of flying, but her passengers didn't seem concerned with aviation safety. The nervous young gunman Sarah had started thinking of him as twitchy, kept checking his watch and muttering in what sounded like Russian. The linebacker, whom she'd mentally dubbed Boris, sat silently watching Marcus, who remained zip-tied and largely unconscious from his earlier head injury. "How much further?" Sarah asked, trying to project calm professionalism while her hands made constant tiny adjustments to keep them from flying into a mountainside. 27 minutes at current speed, the leader replied, consulting his GPS device. "Maintain heading 045 degrees. That heading would take them directly over some of the roughest terrain in the Cascades area, where few aircraft ventured, even in good weather. Sarah knew the region from studying sectional charts, but she'd never flown through it. The peaks rose to over 8,000 feet, and the valleys were narrow corridors filled with downdrafts and wind shear. A sudden gust of wind caught the Huey's tail boom, pushing them sideways toward a barely visible cliff face. Sarah corrected quickly, the old helicopter responding with the solid reliability that had kept it flying for 5 decades. "Turbulence is getting worse," she reported. "We should climb to maintain altitude and heading." The leader cut her off. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, Sarah caught sight of something that made her heart skip. Another aircraft, barely visible through the storm clouds. A helicopter flying roughly parallel to their course, perhaps a mile to the south. One of her classmates was still searching for them. She was about to key her radio when the leader's hand clamped down on her wrist. "No communications. You will maintain radio silence until we reach our destination." "That might be a search and rescue aircraft," Sarah protested. "If I don't respond to their calls, they'll know something's wrong. Let them wonder. By the time they organize an effective search, we will be long gone." The leader's confidence suggested this wasn't his first operation of this type. Sarah filed that information away along with everything else she'd observed: professional equipment, military bearing, detailed intelligence about her and her classmates. These weren't opportunistic criminals. They were part of something organized and well-funded. "Boss," Twitchy called out, his voice tight with anxiety. "Radio traffic indicates search aircraft in the area." Multiple agencies responded. Expected, the leader replied calmly. Our window remains open. Sarah processed this exchange with growing unease. They'd anticipated a search and rescue response, which meant they'd factored it into their planning. Whatever they intended to do at their destination, they expected to accomplish it quickly and escape before authorities could respond effectively. The minutes crawled by as the Huey fought through increasingly violent turbulence. Sarah's arms ached from constant control inputs, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool mountain air. Flying in these conditions required total concentration, leaving little mental capacity for planning an escape. But gradually, a plan began to form. The leader had made several assumptions about her abilities based on her age and equipment. He saw her as a competent but unremarkable pilot flying an obsolete aircraft. What he didn't know was that she'd spent 2 summers working with her grandfather on medical evacuations in Alaska. Flying in weather conditions that would ground commercial operations, she'd learned to read wind patterns by watching cloud formations, to find updrafts and avoid downdrafts by observing how rain moved across the landscape. Most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the safest course of action looked like the most dangerous one. 15 minutes to destination, the leader announced. Checking his GPS again, Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on a wall of darker clouds building ahead of them. The storm was intensifying, and they were flying directly into its heart. She could see lightning flickering in the distance and feel the increasing turbulence that preceded severe weather. We need to alter course, she said. That's a thunderstorm cell ahead. Flying into it would be maintain heading. Sir, I'm not sure you understand. Helicopters can't fly through thunderstorms. The downdrafts alone. Your grandfather flew through worse conditions in Alaska. I researched his service record extensively. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This man knew details about her family history that she'd never shared with anyone at flight school. His operation wasn't just well planned, it was specifically designed around her capabilities and limitations. 10 minutes out, Boris reported, speaking for the first time since takeoff. His voice was deep and heavily accented. Ahead, the storm clouds towered above them like a dark wall, shot through with veins of lightning. Rain drummed harder against the windscreen, and the Huey began to shake from wind gusts that felt like giant, invisible hands trying to swat them from the sky. There, the leader pointed through the gloom, the facility. Sarah squinted through the storm and saw it a cluster of buildings, nestled in a valley that shouldn't have contained any human habitation. From the air, it looked like a small research station or mining operation, with several metal buildings arranged around a central courtyard. But something about the layout nagged at her. The buildings were too uniform, too precisely positioned. It looked like a military compound. Set down in the central clearing, the leader instructed. Quick landing, engines running. We will be on the ground for exactly 7 minutes. What is this place? Sarah asked. A research facility. Nothing that concerns you. But as they descended toward the compound, Sarah caught sight of details that contradicted the research facility story. Armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Vehicles that looked more military than civilian. And most disturbing of all, a large dish antenna that was tracking their approach with mechanical precision. They weren't just landing at some remote outpost. This was a destination someone had been expecting them to reach. The Huey settled into the muddy courtyard with a solid thump, and immediately the compound came alive with activity. Men in tactical gear ran toward them through the rain, and Sarah could see more personnel moving between the buildings. Cargo out now, the leader barked. Boris and Twitchy grabbed the heavy duffel bags and hauled them toward the main building, where several men waited with a cart designed to transport equipment. Whatever was in those bags was apparently valuable enough to justify an elaborate helicopter hijacking. You will remain in the pilot's seat, the leader told Sarah. Engine running, ready for immediate departure. Any attempt to contact authorities or leave this location will result in your friend's immediate execution." Marcus groaned and lifted his head, blood still trickling from his forehead wound. His eyes found Sarah's in the rearview mirror, and she saw fear but also something else: determination. "Sarah," he whispered, barely audible over the engine noise. "The GPS tracker in my flight suit, it's still active. They didn't find it." The leader was already heading toward the main building, apparently confident that Sarah wouldn't abandon Marcus or attempt to take off without him. But he'd underestimated both of them. "Where is it?" Sarah whispered back. "Chest pocket, hidden compartment. But I can't reach it with my hands tied." Sarah glanced toward the building where her captors had disappeared. Through the rain-streaked windows, she could see figures moving around what looked like electronic equipment. Whatever operation was taking place, it required precision and coordination. She made a decision that her grandfather would have understood. Sometimes you had to take calculated risks to save lives. Leaving the engine running, Sarah unbuckled her harness and climbed into the cabin. Her hands shook as she searched Marcus's flight suit, finally finding a hidden zipper that concealed a small GPS beacon no bigger than a coin. "Emergency frequency?" she asked. "Channel 16, already programmed." Sarah activated the beacon and tucked it under a seat cushion where it wouldn't be easily found. If anyone was monitoring emergency frequencies, they'd now have their exact location. "Sarah," Marcus said urgently, "whatever they're doing here, it's not just about stealing equipment. I heard them talking while you were landing. They mentioned something about the network and final phase. This is bigger than just us." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the compound's main door burst open. The leader emerged with his team, but their body language had changed. Instead of the controlled confidence they displayed earlier, they moved with urgent haste. "Something's wrong," Sarah muttered, climbing back into the pilot's seat. The leader sprinted toward the helicopter, his face grim. Behind him, alarm bells began ringing throughout the compound, and Sarah could see personnel running between buildings. "Go, go, go," the leader shouted as he dove into the cabin. "Take off immediately. What about the cargo?" "Change of plans. We're leaving now." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She pulled collective and twisted the throttle, lifting the Huey into the storm-darkened sky. Whatever had happened inside that compound, it had clearly not gone according to plan. As they climbed away from the facility, Sarah caught a glimpse of vehicles approaching through the valley, black SUVs moving fast despite the rough terrain and poor weather. Someone else had found the compound. "Who are those people?" she asked. "None of your concern," the leader snapped, but his voice carried an edge of worry that hadn't been there before. "Heading 270 degrees. Maximum speed." That heading would take them west, back toward the coast and away from the mountains. Sarah banked the Huey through the turbulent air, fighting wind gusts that seemed determined to flip them upside down. "Boss," Twitchy called out, his voice tight with panic. "They're following us." Through the rain, Sarah could see another helicopter rising from the compound, a sleek black aircraft that looked military in design. It climbed rapidly, gaining on them despite the Huey's head start. "Faster," the leader demanded. "This is maximum speed," Sarah replied. The Huey wasn't built for racing. She was lying, of course. The old helicopter had more power in reserve, but revealing that fact might eliminate her only advantage. As long as her captors believed they were pushing the aircraft to its limits, they wouldn't know what she was truly capable of. The pursuing helicopter was closing the distance steadily. Sarah could see it clearly, now a modern military transport with sophisticated avionics and significantly more speed than her vintage machine. "They're gaining," Boris reported unnecessarily. "Evasive maneuvers," the leader ordered. "In this weather? That's suicide. Do it." Sarah had no choice but to comply, but she did so on her own terms. instead of random turns that would quickly exhaust their fuel and leave them vulnerable. She began using the terrain to her advantage, diving into valleys where the pursuing helicopter's speed would be less useful, then climbing along ridgelines where updrafts could give the Huey additional lift. It was dangerous flying, the kind that required split-second decisions and intimate knowledge of how an aircraft behaved in extreme conditions. But it was also the kind of flying her grandfather had taught her, and the kind that the Huey had been designed for. The pursuing helicopter fell back slightly, its pilot apparently unwilling to match Sarah's aggressive use of terrain. But it was still there, following their every move. "They're staying with us," Sarah reported. "Then we changed the game," the leader said grimly. He pulled out his handheld radio and spoke rapidly in a foreign language. Within minutes, Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. 2 more helicopters appeared on the horizon, approaching from different directions. Her captors had backup plans, and those plans involved overwhelming force. "Sarah," Marcus whispered from behind her. "The beacon. Is it still transmitting?" She couldn't check without alerting her captors, but she hoped the small device was still broadcasting their location to anyone monitoring emergency frequencies. Help would have to find them soon, or there wouldn't be anyone left to rescue. Huey bucked through another bout of severe turbulence as lightning flashed uncomfortably close to their position. The storm was reaching its peak intensity, turning the sky into a chaos of wind and rain that challenged even Sarah's considerable skills. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice strained from fighting the controls. "Rendezvous point Alpha." The leader replied, "Coordinates coming up on your GPS." Sarah glanced at her ancient GPS unit and felt her heart sink. The coordinates pointed to a location near the coast, a remote area where another aircraft could be waiting to extract her captors and eliminate any witnesses. She was running out of time and options, but as the Huey fought through the storm toward an uncertain fate, Sarah realized that her captors had made one crucial error in their planning. They'd assumed that flying an old helicopter made her a less capable pilot. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The storm reached its full fury as 3 helicopters converged on the Huey from different directions, their modern avionics cutting through the weather with electronic precision that Sarah's analog instruments couldn't match. Rain lashed the windscreen so hard it sounded like gravel, and lightning turned the sky into a strobing nightmare of white-hot electricity. 2 minutes to intercept, Boris reported, monitoring a handheld device that tracked the approaching aircraft. Sarah's mind raced through her rapidly diminishing options. The Huey was tough and reliable, but it wasn't fast enough to outrun modern helicopters in open sky. Her only advantages were terrain knowledge, weather flying experience, and the fact that her captors still underestimated what the old aircraft could do. "Descent to 500 feet, the leader ordered. "Follow the valley system toward the coast." That would take them through Devil's Canyon, the same narrow gorge that had been part of the original training exercise. Sarah knew the terrain from studying sectional charts, but she'd never flown through it in weather this severe. "Sir, Devil's Canyon is extremely dangerous in these conditions. The downdrafts alone. Your grandfather flew through worse." The leader cut her off. "Follow my coordinates precisely." As they descended toward the canyon entrance, Sarah caught sight of the pursuing helicopters converging behind them. The lead aircraft was close enough now that she could see its sleek lines and military markings. Whatever agency was chasing them had serious resources. "They're military," she said, hoping to plant seeds of doubt in her captors' minds. "We know exactly who they are," the leader replied coldly. "Continue descent." The Huey dropped into Devil's Canyon like a stone falling into a well. The walls rose up on either side, dark granite faces slick with rain and shrouded in mist. Wind howled through the narrow passage, creating updrafts and downdrafts that bounced the helicopter around like a toy. Sarah had to use every ounce of skill to keep them centered in the canyon. The Huey's controls felt heavy and sluggish in the turbulent air, requiring constant corrections to maintain heading and altitude. Behind them, the pursuing helicopters hesitated at the canyon entrance. Through her mirrors, Sarah could see them hovering at the rim, apparently unwilling to follow her into the narrow passage in these weather conditions. "They're not following," she reported. "They will," the leader said with grim certainty. "They have no choice." As if on cue, the lead military helicopter tilted forward and began its descent into the canyon. Its pilot was skilled, Sarah had to admit that. But the aircraft was built for speed and technology, not for the kind of low-level maneuvering that canyon flying required. The canyon floor rushed past below them, a boulder-strewn creek bed that looked like a moonscape in the storm's half-light. Sarah kept the Huey centered in the passage, using landmarks she could barely see through the rain to navigate. 30 seconds to the canyon exit, Boris announced. That's when Sarah saw her chance. At the canyon's mouth, the passage split into two branches, the main channel that led toward the coast, and a smaller side canyon that doubled back toward the mountains. The side canyon was narrower, more dangerous, and according to her sectional charts, it led to a dead end. It was also invisible from the air until you were right on top of it. "Which way?" she asked, though she already knew what the leader would say. "Main channel, bearing 285 degrees. Sarah nodded and banked slightly right, as if preparing to follow the main canyon toward the coast. But at the last possible second, she yanked the cyclic hard left and dove into the side canyon. "What are you doing?" the leader shouted. "Evasive maneuvers," Sarah replied grimly, "like you ordered." The side canyon was barely wide enough for the Huey's rotor disc. Sarah had to fly with precision that left no margin for error, the blade tips passing within feet of the granite walls. The old helicopter responded to her inputs with mechanical reliability, but one moment of inattention would turn them into a fireball. Behind them, chaos erupted on the radio frequencies as the pursuing helicopters tried to figure out where their quarry had gone. Sarah caught fragments of transmissions, professional voices coordinating search patterns and reporting negative contact. "You cannot escape this way," the leader said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "This canyon leads nowhere." "Maybe," Sarah replied, wrestling with the controls as wind gusts tried to slam them into the canyon walls. "But it buys us time." What she didn't tell him was that she was betting everything on a feature marked on her sectional chart, a notation that indicated abandoned mining tunnel about 2 miles ahead. If the tunnel was large enough, and if she could find it in this weather, it might provide the concealment they needed. If not, they were all going to die in the next few minutes. The canyon walls closed in around them, and Sarah found herself flying through a passage so narrow that the Huey's rotor wash echoed off both sides simultaneously. Rain and mist reduced visibility to almost zero, forcing her to navigate by instinct and the subtle changes in wind patterns that indicated obstacles ahead. "There!" Marcus suddenly shouted from behind her. "Opening on the right." Sarah saw a dark shadow in the canyon wall that might have been natural formation, or might have been the mining tunnel marked on her chart. It was barely large enough for a helicopter, assuming she could approach it at exactly the right angle. "That's impossible," Twitchy whispered. "Hold on," Sarah said through gritted teeth. She brought the Huey into a hover, feeling the aircraft's limitations as downdrafts from the canyon walls tried to slam them into the ground. The tunnel opening was perhaps 50 feet above the canyon floor, requiring a precise hover taxi that would test both her skills and the helicopter's capabilities. Inch by inch, she worked the Huey sideways and upward, using collective and anti-torque pedals to maintain position while the canyon winds tried to destroy them. The rotor disc passed within feet of the tunnel entrance, and she could hear the blade tips cutting through wisps of mist. "You're insane," the leader breathed. "Probably," Sarah agreed, then added power and slid the Huey into the tunnel. Darkness enveloped them as they entered the abandoned mine. Sarah switched on her landing light, revealing rough-hewn walls that extended far back into the mountain. The tunnel was larger than it had appeared from outside, wide enough for the helicopter, with perhaps 10 feet of clearance on each side. She brought the Huey to a hover near the tunnel entrance, hidden from external view but ready to move if necessary. Through the opening, she could see the canyon where they'd been flying moments before, now empty except for rain and mist. "Engine to idle," she announced, reducing power to minimum levels. "We wait." The sudden quiet was deafening after hours of engine noise and storm sounds. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat and the labored breathing of her passengers. Outside, lightning continued to flash, but the thunder was muffled by tons of rock above their heads. "How did you know about this place?" the leader asked, his voice carrying grudging respect. "Lucky guess," Sarah lied. She wasn't about to reveal that she'd spent countless hours studying sectional charts, memorizing every landmark and emergency. Landing site in the region. Minutes passed. Then, through the tunnel opening, they heard the distinctive sound of helicopters passing overhead. The pursuing aircraft were continuing their search down the main canyon, apparently unaware that their quarry had vanished into solid rock. "They're gone," Boris reported unnecessarily. "For now," the leader corrected. "But they will expand their search pattern. We cannot remain here indefinitely." He was right, Sarah knew. The tunnel provided temporary concealment, but it wasn't a permanent solution. Eventually, the storm would pass, search aircraft would return, and they'd be trapped with nowhere to run, unless she could find a way to turn the tables. "Marcus," she whispered, ostensibly checking her instruments. "The beacon. Is it still transmitting?" "Should be," he whispered back. "Military-grade battery, designed for 72-hour operation." That meant help might already be triangulating their position, even inside the tunnel. Sarah felt a flicker of hope, but she knew better than to count on rescue. In her experience, the only person you could really depend on was yourself. "We need to move," the leader announced after listening to radio traffic on his handheld device. "Our extraction point has been compromised. New coordinates uploading to your GPS." Sarah glanced at her ancient GPS unit and felt her blood run cold. The new coordinates were even more remote than the original rendezvous location near the Canadian border, where no one would think to look for them. "That's over 200 miles, she protested. "We don't have enough fuel." "Then we will make fuel stops," the leader replied. "I have contingency plans." Of course he did. This entire operation had been planned with military precision, complete, with backup plans for every contingency. Except perhaps for a pilot who knew these mountains better than his intelligence files had indicated. "Start the engine," he ordered. "We leave in 60 seconds. As Sarah began her startup procedure, her mind worked frantically on the problem. She had one more card to play, a desperate gambit that might save them all or get them killed. But it would require precise timing, and more luck than she'd had any right to expect. The Huey's turbine wound up to operating speed, and Sarah engaged the rotor system. Outside the tunnel, the storm was beginning to weaken slightly, though visibility was still poor. "Move out," the leader commanded. Sarah eased the helicopter forward, approaching the tunnel entrance with careful precision. As they emerged into the gray light of the storm, she scanned the sky for any sign of pursuing aircraft. The canyon appeared empty. "Heading 015 degrees, the leader announced, reading from his GPS device. "Follow the valley system north." Sarah acknowledged the heading but didn't immediately turn toward it. Instead, she continued straight ahead, following the canyon toward what appeared to be open terrain. "I said 015 degrees, the leader repeated, his voice carrying a warning edge. "Just clearing the canyon walls," Sarah replied. "I need maneuvering room for the turn." It was partially true. The canyon was still narrow enough to make sharp turns dangerous. But Sarah had another reason for continuing straight ahead. Her sectional chart showed something the leader's GPS device apparently didn't. A weather monitoring station about 5 miles ahead, complete with radio equipment and most importantly fuel storage. If she could reach the station and get a message out, help might arrive before her captors realized what was happening. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. The Huey climbed out of the canyon into the full fury of the storm, rain drumming against the windscreen like machine gunfire. Behind them, the narrow passage they'd navigated looked impossible in the gray light, a feat of flying that shouldn't have been survivable, but they had survived. And now Sarah had to figure out how to stay alive long enough to get help. The game was far from over. The weather monitoring station materialized out of the storm, like a mirage, a cluster of white buildings and radio towers perched on a ridge overlooking the valley. Sarah could see the distinctive orange windsock that marked it as an aviation facility, along with the fuel tanks that represented her only hope of extending their flight time. "What is that facility?" the leader demanded, following her gaze. "Weather monitoring station," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Automated systems, no permanent staff." She was lying again. Most weather stations had at least a skeleton crew during storm events, and this one was equipped with powerful radio transmitters that could reach air traffic control centers hundreds of miles away. "We will not stop there," the leader said firmly. "Sir, we need fuel. The new coordinates you gave me are beyond our current range." She could see him calculating distances and fuel consumption rates in his head. He was clearly familiar with aircraft operations, which made him more dangerous but also more predictable. "How much fuel do we have?" he asked. Sarah glanced at her fuel gauge, a simple analog instrument that showed about 40% remaining. "Maybe an hour of flight time, depending on weather conditions. That is insufficient for our destination. The station should have aviation fuel. Standard 100 octane, compatible with our engine. Quick refuel, maybe 10 minutes on the ground." The leader studied the facility through binoculars, searching for signs of activity. The buildings appeared dark and empty, their windows reflecting the gray stormlight. "Very well," he decided. "Quick fuel stop only. No communications, no delays." Sarah nodded and began her approach to the station's small landing pad. As they descended, she caught sight of details that gave her hope, a radio antenna array that looked more sophisticated than a simple weather monitoring installation, and tire tracks in the mud that suggested recent vehicle activity. Someone was here, or had been recently. The Huey settled onto the landing pad with a solid thump, and immediately, the leader was issuing orders. "Boris, secure the perimeter. Twitchy, help with fuel operations. I will monitor radio frequencies." As her captors deployed around the landing area, Sarah remained in the pilot's seat, ostensibly running post-landing checks. But her real attention was focused on the main building, where she thought she'd seen a flicker of light in one of the windows. "Fuel pumps are over there," she announced, pointing to a cluster of equipment near the largest building. "I'll need to reposition the aircraft." "Make it quick," the leader replied. Following Boris toward the fuel area, Sarah lifted the Huey off the pad and taxied toward the fuel pumps, using the movement to block her captor's view of the main building. As she brought the helicopter to a hover near the pumps, she caught sight of a face in one of the building's windows, a bearded man in a flannel shirt who was watching the proceedings with obvious alarm. A weather station operator, probably trying to figure out why armed men were helping themselves to government fuel. Sarah made a decision that would have terrified her an hour earlier. She activated her emergency transponder device that would immediately alert air traffic control to her exact position and indicate an aircraft in distress. The signal would take several minutes to propagate through the storms. Interference But once it reached the control centers, every available search and rescue asset would converge on their location. She just had to keep everyone alive until help arrived. Fuel operations complete, Boris reported, replacing the fuel nozzle with military efficiency. Tanks topped off. The refueling had taken less than 8 minutes, fast enough to minimize their exposure, but long enough for Sarah's emergency signal to start working through the aviation system. "Excellent," the leader said, climbing back into the Huey. "Resume course 015 degrees, maximum speed to the border." As they lifted off from the weather station, Sarah saw the bearded man emerge from the main building and wave frantically at their departing helicopter. He was holding what looked like a radio handset, probably trying to report the unauthorized landing to whatever authorities monitored the facility. Good, Sarah thought. The more people who knew about their location and heading, the better. "Faster," the leader urged as they climbed back into the storm. "This is maximum cruise speed," Sarah lied, keeping the Huey's airspeed at about 90 knots instead of its actual top speed of over 120. Every minute of delay increased the chances that help would find them. The storm was finally beginning to weaken as they flew north toward the Canadian border. Visibility improved slightly, and the worst of the turbulence was behind them. But that also meant pursuing aircraft would have an easier time tracking them. "Boss," Twitchy called out, monitoring his radio equipment. "Heavy radio traffic on emergency frequencies. Search and rescue coordination, multiple agencies responding." "Expected," the leader replied, but Sarah could hear tension in his voice. "How much time to the border?" 47 minutes at current. "Speed," Boris answered, checking his GPS device. 40-7 minutes. Sarah's emergency transponder would have been active for about 15 minutes now, which meant search aircraft were probably already being dispatched. But 47 minutes was a long time in aviation, enough to cross into international airspace where pursuit would become more complicated. "Contact our extraction team," the leader ordered. "Confirm readiness for pickup." As Twitchy worked his radio, Sarah listened carefully to the coded conversation. She couldn't understand the language, but the tone suggested coordination with assets already in position near the border. Her captors weren't just hoping to escape, they had a detailed exfiltration plan that probably included crossing into Canada and disappearing into the vast wilderness. "Sarah," Marcus whispered from behind her, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "My head's clearing up. These zip ties, I think I can work my hands free." "Don't try anything yet," she whispered back. "Wait for my signal." "What signal?" "Good question." Sarah wasn't sure what her signal would be, but she knew they'd only get one chance to turn the tables. If Marcus broke free too early, their captors would simply kill him and continue with their escape plan. "Aircraft approaching from the south," Boris announced, studying his surveillance equipment. "Fast movers, probably military." Through her mirrors, Sarah could see specks in the distance that might have been helicopters or fixed-wing aircraft. The cavalry was coming, but they were still miles away. "Evasive maneuvers," the leader ordered. "Use terrain masking." Sarah obediently dove toward the valley floor, using ridgelines and forest cover to break up their radar signature. The Huey's low-level handling was superior to most modern helicopters, a legacy of its combat design, and she used that advantage to stay hidden from pursuing aircraft. But terrain masking only worked if you knew the terrain, and Sarah was approaching the limits of her geographical knowledge. The sectional charts in her flight bag covered their current area, but beyond the border lay unfamiliar territory. "Extraction point in sight," Twitchy reported, pointing ahead through the windscreen. Sarah saw a small clearing in the forest where another helicopter waited on the ground. Even through the rain and mist, she could tell it was a different type from anything she'd seen before. Larger, more angular, possibly military surplus from some Eastern European country. Set down 50 meters from the extraction aircraft. Leader instructed. Quick transfer, then we abandon your helicopter. What about Marcus and me? You have served your purpose, the leader replied coldly. Your fate depends on how cooperative you remain during the final phase. Sarah felt ice in her veins. They'd never intended to let her live. She'd been useful for getting them through the storm and past the search aircraft, but now she was just a liability to be eliminated. The extraction helicopter's rotors were already turning, ready for immediate departure. Sarah could see figures moving around it, more armed men preparing to complete whatever mission had brought them to this remote location. 50 meters out, she announced, beginning her approach to the clearing. Boss, Twitchy said urgently, multiple aircraft converging on our position. Military frequencies are going crazy. Through the trees, Sarah could see the distinctive shapes of approaching helicopters, at least 3 aircraft coming from different directions, moving fast and low. Land now. The leader shouted. Sarah flared the Huey into a quick stop, but instead of settling into the clearing as ordered, she held the helicopter in a hover about 10 feet off the ground. It was a dangerous position that required constant attention to maintain, but it also kept their options open, on the ground. The leader demanded, raising his weapon. Downdrafts are too strong, Sarah replied, fighting the controls as if the helicopter was trying to settle on its own. Need to find a better spot. It was her last desperate gambit, keeping them airborne and mobile for as long as possible while help arrived. But she could see the extraction team below growing impatient, their leader gesturing angrily at the hovering Huey. Then everything went to hell at once. The first military helicopter burst over the tree line at high speed, followed immediately by 2 others from different directions. Sarah caught a glimpse of door gunners and external weapons pods, serious hardware that meant business. Attention aircraft in the clearing, a voice boomed from external speakers. You are surrounded. Land immediately and surrender. The leader's face twisted with rage and desperation. He raised his rifle toward Sarah's head, his finger tightening on the trigger. Sarah now! Marcus shouted, having finally worked his hands free of the zip ties. Sarah didn't hesitate. She yanked the collective full up and twisted the throttle to maximum power, sending the Huey rocketing skyward as Marcus launched himself at the leader. The sudden acceleration threw everyone off balance, and the leader's shot went wide, punching a hole through the cabin roof instead of Sarah's skull. Old helicopter climbed like a homesick angel, its turbine engine screaming at redline power. Below them, the clearing erupted in chaos as the extraction team scattered and the military helicopters moved in for landing. Controls! Sarah shouted to Marcus as she wrestled with the cyclic. Help me fly this thing. Marcus grabbed the collective from his position in the cabin, helping to maintain their climb while Sarah fought to keep them stable. The Huey was at the edge of its performance envelope, climbing through air so thin that the rotor blades were barely generating enough lift to keep them airborne. Behind them, Twitchy had his weapon out, but seemed paralyzed by the chaos. Boris was unconscious, having struck his head during the violent climb. And the leader was fighting desperately with Marcus for control of the rifle. The weapon discharged again, this time through the cabin floor. Sarah felt the helicopter shudder as the bullet possibly damaged something important, but the engine continued running and the controls still responded. Mountain! Marcus yelled, pointing ahead through the windscreen dot. Sarah saw a granite peak rising directly in front of them, its summit shrouded in clouds. They were climbing straight toward it at maximum power, and she wasn't sure they had enough altitude to clear the ridge. Hold on! She shouted, pulling back on the cyclic to trade airspeed for altitude. The Huey's nose came up, bleeding off forward speed as they approached the mountain face. Sarah could see individual rocks and trees on the slope, growing larger with terrifying speed. They were going to hit. Then, at the last possible second, They cleared the ridge by perhaps 20 feet, the helicopter's landing gear almost brushing the granite as they shot over the summit and into the valley beyond. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed. Still grappling with the leader for the rifle, Sarah leveled off on the other side of the mountain, her hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Behind them, she could see the military helicopters continuing their pursuit, but they'd gained precious distance during the climb. "Where are we going?" Marcus asked. Good question. They were flying blind in unfamiliar territory, burning fuel at maximum rate, with armed men still in their cabin and military aircraft in pursuit. But for the first time in hours, Sarah felt like they had a chance. The ancient Huey had done what no modern helicopter could have managed, climbed to nearly 10,000 feet at full power while carrying a combat load, cleared a mountain that should have been impossible to cross, and kept flying despite taking gunfire. Her grandfather's old warhorse still had some fight left in it. "Sarah," Marcus called out, having finally wrestled the rifle away from the leader, "I've got them covered. But we need a plan." Sarah looked at her fuel gauge. 15 minutes of flight time remaining, maybe less at this power setting. They needed to land soon, somewhere safe, where help could reach them. Through the windscreen, she could see another valley ahead, this one containing what looked like a small town or village. Civilization meant people, communications, and hopefully law enforcement. "Hold tight," she told Marcus, beginning their descent toward what she hoped would be safety. Behind them, the military helicopters crested the mountain ridge, still in pursuit, but no longer gaining ground. The Huey's desperate climb had bought them the time they needed. Now, they just had to survive the landing. The small mountain town of Cedar Falls spread out below them like a postcard scene, white houses with red roofs, a main street lined with shops, and most importantly, a small airport with what appeared to be emergency vehicles already positioned on the runway. "They're expecting us," Sarah realized, watching ambulances and fire trucks moving into position. The emergency transponder signal and radio traffic from the weather station had done their job. Every law enforcement and emergency services agency in the region now knew about their situation and approximate location. "Sarah," Marcus called from the cabin, still keeping the rifle trained on their subdued captors. "The leader's been talking on his radio again. I think he's trying to coordinate something." Sarah glanced back and saw the leader speaking urgently into his handheld device, his voice too quiet to hear over the engine noise. Whatever he was planning, it involved people on the ground. "Boss," Twitchy said weakly, blood running from a cut on his forehead, "the network is compromised. Extraction failed. Orders are to eliminate all witnesses and abort." The leader's eyes met Sarah's in the rearview mirror, and she saw something that chilled her, the cold calculation of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Land in the town square," he ordered, his voice carrying deadly certainty. "Maximum chaos. Maximum confusion. In the confusion, we disappear." "I'm landing at the airport," Sarah replied firmly. "Emergency services are standing by. Land in the town square, or I will shoot your friend, and then you." Sarah glanced at her fuel gauge. 8 minutes remaining. They were committed to landing somewhere in the next few minutes whether she wanted to or not. "The square is too small," she protested. "Too many power lines, too many people. It's impossible. Your grandfather landed in smaller spaces during his military service. I researched his combat record thoroughly." Once again, the leader's detailed intelligence made Sarah wonder just how long they'd been planning this operation. Someone had spent considerable time studying her background, her capabilities, even her family history. Through the windscreen, she could see the town square, a patch of grass perhaps 60 feet across, surrounded by buildings and crisscrossed with power lines. It was technically large enough for a helicopter landing, but with no margin for error. "Too dangerous," she said. "I won't risk civilian casualties." "Then you condemn your friend to death," the leader replied, pressing his backup pistol against Marcus's temple. Sarah felt the familiar weight of impossible choices. Land in the square and risk killing innocent people in the town. Refuse and watch Marcus die. Try to overpower armed men while flying a helicopter with almost no fuel remaining. Then Marcus made the choice for her. Sarah, remember what your grandfather taught you about emergency landings, he said, his voice steady despite the gun at his head. Sometimes you have to trust the aircraft to do what it was designed to do. It took Sarah a moment to understand what he meant. Then she remembered a story her grandfather had told her about Vietnam, an emergency landing in a jungle clearing too small for their helicopter, made possible only by using a technique called a power-on stall that could stop the aircraft in mid-air. It was incredibly dangerous, requiring split-second timing and perfect control inputs. But it might work. Roger that, she told Marcus, hoping he understood that she'd gotten his message. She began her approach to the town square, the Huey descending through turbulent air created by the surrounding buildings. People on the streets below scattered as they saw the helicopter approaching, some running into buildings while others stood and stared. 50 feet, Sarah announced, fighting downdrafts and wind gusts. 30 feet. 20 feet. At 15 feet above the square, with power lines visible on either side of the rotor disc, Sarah executed the most dangerous maneuver of her flying career. She pulled full back pressure on the cyclic, while simultaneously reducing power to idle. The Huey's nose came up sharply, bleeding off all forward airspeed in a matter of seconds. For a moment, they hung motionless in the air like a hummingbird, suspended by momentum and physics. Then she rolled the throttle back to flight idle and let the helicopter settle vertically into the square. The landing was harder than she'd intended. The Huey hit the grass with enough force to compress the landing gear struts and bounce slightly. But they were down, intact, and surrounded by buildings that would make it difficult for anyone to escape on foot. Engine shut down, Sarah announced, beginning her post-landing checklist. As the turbine wound down and the rotor blades began to slow, the leader seemed to realize that his escape options had just evaporated. The town square was surrounded by police vehicles, emergency services, and what appeared to be federal agents. You have destroyed everything, he said to Sarah, his voice filled with cold fury. Good, she replied, shutting down electrical systems and securing the aircraft. The leader raised his pistol toward Sarah's head, but Marcus was ready. He swung the rifle butt in a short arc that caught the leader in the temple, dropping him unconscious to the cabin floor. Clear, Marcus announced, kicking the pistol away from the leader's unconscious form. Through the windscreen, Sarah could see armed officers approaching the helicopter from multiple directions, moving with tactical precision. Someone was shouting instructions through a bullhorn, but the words were muffled by the helicopter's aluminum skin. Sarah, Marcus said quietly, I need to tell you something before they take us into custody. She turned to look at him, noting for the first time that his injured appearance looked almost too perfect, like makeup applied by a professional. I'm not really a flight school student, he continued. I'm Agent Marcus Steele, D. This whole operation was a setup to identify and capture an international smuggling network that's been using civilian aircraft to transport weapons and drugs across the border. Sarah stared at him in shock. You're a federal agent? D. Working with Homeland Security and the FBI. We've been tracking this network for 2 years. They specialize in using civilian aircraft and pilots for smuggling operations. Always someone expendable. Someone who wouldn't be missed if things went wrong. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The engine failure wasn't random. You knew. They were going to target you. We suspected they'd been monitoring flight schools, looking for the right combination of skilled pilots and desperate circumstances. Your financial situation, your grandfather's reputation, your isolated status, you were the perfect candidate. Sarah felt a mix of anger and relief. So everything that happened today, double quotes, was real danger with real consequences. These people don't hesitate to kill, and if you hadn't been as skilled as you are, we'd all be dead. The electromagnetic pulse. That disabled my helicopter was genuine, the weapons were real, and their willingness to execute witnesses was absolutely authentic. Outside the helicopter, tactical officers had surrounded the aircraft and were shouting for everyone to exit with their hands visible. Sarah could see news crews setting up beyond the police perimeter, their cameras already rolling. The compound. We visited, Sarah said, beginning to understand the scope of the operation. What was that place? A communications hub for their network. They were downloading encrypted files containing shipping schedules, routes, and contact information for cells across North America. When we arrived, they were in the middle of transferring everything to portable drives. And the alarm that went off? Our backup team had finally located the facility. The timing was closer than we'd planned, but it worked out. Sort of. Sarah shook her head, still processing the revelation. Why didn't you tell me? I could have helped. Because your reactions had to be authentic. These people are professionals. They would have detected any deception immediately. Your fear, your anger, your desperation to survive, all of that was real. And it's what convinced them you were just an unlucky civilian. The helicopter's door opened, and tactical officers began boarding to secure the unconscious prisoners. Sarah and Marcus were escorted out with their hands visible, though the officers' treatment was professional rather than hostile. Agent Steele. One of the tactical officers said, "Good to see you in one piece. Command wants a full debrief ASAP. Roger that. But first, make sure Miss Chen gets medical attention. She's been through hell today." As they were led away from the helicopter, Sarah caught sight of the Huey sitting in the town square, like a museum piece surrounded by modern emergency vehicles. The old aircraft looked tired but dignified, its faded paint and patched skin telling the story of decades of faithful service. "What happened to my helicopter?" she asked. "Evidence for now," Marcus replied. "But after the investigation, it should be returned to you. Assuming you want it back after today." Sarah looked at the ancient machine that had carried them through impossible conditions, survived gunfire, and ultimately delivered them to safety. Despite everything that had happened, she felt a surge of affection for the old war horse. "Yeah," she said, "I want it back." The FBI field office in Seattle was a study in government efficiency, fluorescent lights, institutional furniture, and coffee that could strip paint. Sarah sat in a conference room that smelled like disinfectant and stale air conditioning, still wearing her flight suit and trying to process everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. Agent Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the wealthy. Aviation heiress Brittany Walsh. She'd been careful to point out, sat across from Sarah with a thick file folder and a digital recorder. "Let's start from the beginning," Agent Walsh said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who'd conducted thousands of interviews. "What was your first indication that something was wrong with the training exercise?" Sarah walked through the entire sequence of events, from Marcus's emergency call to the final landing in Cedar Falls. Agent Walsh took detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. "The compound in the mountains," Agent Walsh said, consulting her file. "Can you describe what you saw inside the buildings?" "I never went inside. But through the windows, I could see electronic equipment, computers, people working at stations that looked like a command center. The equipment they loaded into your helicopter, you said there were 2 duffel bags, heavy ones. I caught a glimpse of electronics, maybe weapons or specialized tools. Whatever it was, they considered it valuable enough to risk this entire operation." Agent Walsh made another note. "Those bags contained hard drives with encrypted financial records, shipping manifests, and communication protocols for what we believe is one of the largest international smuggling networks operating in North America. So the whole thing was about data theft? Partly. But the compound served another purpose. It was a relay station for coordinating smuggling operations across the western United States and Canada. Ships arriving at remote ports, aircraft crossing borders at unmonitored locations, ground transportation. NETWORK, as moving everything from drugs to weapons to human trafficking victims. Sarah felt sick. And they were going to use my helicopter for this. Your aircraft was perfect for their needs. Old enough to avoid modern tracking systems, simple enough to operate without specialized training, and robust enough to carry cargo to remote locations. Plus, if something went wrong, they could claim. It was just a student pilot who got lost or crashed due to weather. What about the leader? Who was he? Agent Walsh consulted another file. Viktor Kozlov, former Spetsnaz, wanted by authorities in 6 countries. His specialty is recruiting civilian assets for military-style operations. The other 2 were part of his team mercenaries with experience in Eastern European conflicts. And they specifically targeted me, you, and about a dozen other student pilots at various schools across the country. They'd been monitoring flight, training programs for months, looking for candidates who met their criteria. Skilled but isolated, financially vulnerable, flying older aircraft that wouldn't be easily tracked. Sarah thought about her classmates Marcus, Agent Steele, Brittany with her wealthy family connections, Thompson with his new Robinson helicopter. None of them would have been suitable for Kozlov's purposes. How many other operations like this were they planning? Based on the data we recovered, at least 20 major smuggling runs over the next 6 months. Conservative estimate of the cargo value is over $50 million. Agent Walsh closed the file and leaned back in her chair. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Would you be interested in working with us on future operations? As bait? As a pilot? We need people with your skills, someone who can fly older aircraft in challenging conditions, who can think quickly under pressure, and who has proven they can handle themselves in dangerous situations. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering. The offer, what kind of work? Similar to what Agent Steele was doing, undercover operations, targeting criminal networks that use aviation for illegal activities. It's dangerous work, but it's also important work. And it pays considerably better than commercial aviation. I need to think about it. Of course, take your time. Agent Walsh stood up and moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. Your performance today was extraordinary. Flying through that storm, navigating terrain that challenged experienced military pilots, making that landing in the town square. Most pilots wouldn't have survived what you went through. I had a good teacher, Sarah replied, thinking of her grandfather. Yes, you did. William Chen was a legend in Alaska aviation circles, but what you did today was all you. After Agent Walsh left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room, staring out the window at the Seattle skyline. The storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming in afternoon sunlight. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Marcus, Agent Steele, entered carrying 2 cups of coffee that looked marginally better than the FBI variety. How are you holding up? He asked, setting 1 cup in front of her. I've been better. It has also been worse. Sarah sipped the coffee and was pleasantly surprised to find it actually drinkable. So Agent Steele, that's really your name? Marcus Steele, yes. Though I'm usually assigned to drug interdiction operations along the Mexican border. This was my first undercover assignment at a civilian flight school. And the rich boy acts? Completely fabricated. I grew up in Detroit, learned to fly in the Army, joined the D after my military service ended. He sat down across from her. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about the deception. And I'm sorry you got pulled into this. But not sorry it worked. Out the way it did? Hell no. You saved both our lives today, Probably dozens of other lives if these smuggling operations had continued. Sarah studied his face, looking for traces of the arrogant flight school student she'd known for 2 years. The basic bone structure was the same, but everything else was different: his posture, his speech patterns, even the way he held his coffee cup. "Were any of your reactions real?" she asked. "The fear, the panic when your helicopter went down, all of it. I knew something was going to happen, but I didn't know when or how. When that electromagnetic pulse hit my aircraft, when I realized I was going down in hostile territory, that fear was completely genuine. And when you thought they were going to kill you? Terrifying. These people don't make empty threats." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "Sarah, I want you to know that what you did today flying in those conditions, making the decisions you made, keeping us alive when everything went to hell, that was heroic." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I was just trying to survive. You were trying to save everyone. There's a difference." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, drinking coffee and watching the afternoon light change across the city. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Agent Walsh offered me a job, I heard." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that finishing flight school suddenly seems a lot less important than it did this morning. The offer's legitimate. We need pilots like you, people who can handle aircraft that aren't in the computer databases, who can fly in conditions that would ground commercial operations. And the danger? Real, but probably not worse than what you went through today." Sarah nodded, already knowing what her answer would be. The events of the day had shown her something about herself, that she was capable of more than she'd imagined, that her grandfather's lessons had prepared her for challenges she'd never expected to face. "When do I start?" she asked. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since she'd known him. "After you finish flight school. The government likes its pilots to have proper credentials, even for unofficial operations. And my helicopter will be returned after the investigation. Though you might want to consider some upgrades: modern radios, better navigation equipment, maybe armor plating." Sarah laughed, surprising herself with the sound. Armor plating for a training helicopter? Hey, you never know what you'll run into. 3 months later, Sarah stood on the tarmac at Meridian Flight Academy, watching her classmates prepare for their final check rides. The morning was clear and calm, perfect flying weather that seemed almost surreal after the storm-lashed chaos of that day in the mountains. The Huey sat in its usual spot, looking better than it had in years. The FBI had returned it with a few modifications that weren't immediately obvious: upgraded RADIO equipment hidden inside the original housings, a more sophisticated GPS system that looked like the old eBay unit, and subtle reinforcements too. The cabin structure that would stop small arms fire. "Look who's back," Brittany Walsh called out as she approached, her attitude noticeably different from their previous interactions. The events of that day had made news across the aviation community, and Sarah had become something of a celebrity among student pilots. "Getting ready for a check ride?" Sarah asked. "Already passed," Brittany replied with a smile that seemed genuine. "The instructor said I handled emergency procedures better than anyone in my class. Funny thing, after hearing what you went through, my worst-case scenarios didn't seem so scary anymore." Other students had gathered around, most of them showing a mixture of respect and curiosity that would have been unimaginable 3 months earlier. The girl with the museum-piece helicopter had proven that sometimes old-fashioned skills mattered more than modern technology. "Is it true you're working for the government now?" asked Thompson, the student who'd been flying the Robinson that day. "I'm still finishing flight school," Sarah replied diplomatically. "After that, we'll see." Professor Martinez approached the group, his weathered face showing approval as he examined Huey's restored condition. "Miss Chen, good to have you back. Ready for your final check ride?" "Yes, sir." "Excellent. We'll be doing advanced navigation in adverse conditions appropriate. considering your recent experience. Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Her final test would be a chance to demonstrate the skills she'd proven under fire, but in controlled conditions that wouldn't involve armed criminals or life-threatening weather as the other. Students dispersed to their aircraft. Professor Martinez pulled Sarah aside. "I've been in aviation for 35 years, he said quietly. "I've seen students with every conceivable advantage, money, connections, the latest equipment. But what you did out there, the way you handled an impossible situation, that's something that can't be taught. Thank you, sir." "Your grandfather would be proud." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I hope so." "No hope about it. You proved that skill and judgment matter more than technology. That's a lesson everyone in aviation needs to remember." An hour later, Sarah was airborne in the Huey, following a navigation course that took her through familiar mountain terrain. The check ride was routine compared to her recent experiences: simple navigation exercises, emergency procedures, and precision flying that felt almost relaxing after months of preparation. As she flew over the valley where the compound had been located, she could see construction equipment working to dismantle the remaining buildings. The criminal network had been rolled up completely, with arrests made in 6 countries and millions of dollars in illegal cargo intercepted. Her radio crackled to life. "Flight 27, this is Meridian Tower. Contact approach control on frequency 119.7 for traffic advisories." "Flight 27 switching to approach control," Sarah replied, making the radio call with practiced professionalism. "Flight 27, approach control, radar contact 12 miles south of the field. Be advised, traffic at your 2 o'clock. 3 miles, same altitude." Sarah looked in the indicated direction and spotted another helicopter, a sleek modern aircraft that looked like military hardware. As it drew closer, she recognized the pilot. "Flight 27, this is Agent Steele. Mind if I join you for the rest of your check ride?" Sarah smiled, keying her microphone. "Roger that, Agent Steele. You're cleared to join up." Marcus's helicopter, a sophisticated FBI aircraft, equipped with every modern convenience, pulled into formation with the ancient Huey. The contrast was striking. Cutting-edge technology flying alongside a machine that predated computer chips. "Nice flying," Marcus's voice came through her headphones. "Are you ready to join the team officially?" "Check ride first," Sarah replied. "Then we'll talk." They flew in formation back toward the airport. 2 helicopters representing different eras of aviation, but united by the skill and dedication of their pilots. As they approached the landing pattern, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with finishing flight school. She'd found her calling, discovered capabilities she hadn't known she possessed, and earned the respect of people whose opinions mattered. Most importantly, she'd proven that her grandfather's lessons about aviation and life were as relevant today as they'd ever been. The Huey settled onto the tarmac with its characteristic solid thump. The old helicopter once again demonstrating its reliability and strength. As Sarah completed her shutdown checklist, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning 3 months ago, when her classmates had mocked her ancient aircraft. Now they understood what she'd always known, that in aviation, as in life, it wasn't about having the newest or most expensive equipment. It was about having the skills, judgment, and determination to handle whatever challenges came your way. And sometimes, it was about having an old helicopter that was too stubborn to quit. Professor Martinez was waiting beside the aircraft as Sarah climbed out of the cockpit. His expression was unreadable, maintaining the serious demeanor required for official check rides. "Miss Chen," he said formally, "congratulations. You've passed your final check ride with flying colors." Sarah felt a surge of relief and accomplishment. After everything that had happened, completing flight school felt like both an ending and a beginning. "Thank you, sir." "Now," Martinez continued, his stern expression breaking into a smile, I believe you have some career decisions to make. Marcus approached from his aircraft, having completed his own shutdown procedures. The offer's still open, he said. We could use someone with your unique qualifications. Sarah looked around the airport at her classmates preparing for their own futures, at the mix of modern and vintage aircraft that represented decades of aviation progress, at the mountains, in the distance where she'd proven herself under the most challenging conditions imaginable. When do I start? She asked. What did you think of this thrilling journey? Share your favorite moment in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest dailies. What kind of story would you like to hear next? Let me know in the comments.